So I was thinking about what to talk about with these technologies that are going to be impacting everyone. And I really came up with two issues. And the first was that it's so hard to predict technologies in the next 10 or even 20 years. But I think just as importantly, it's always kind of a bleak future that we kind of look out and see 15, 20 years. I think most people kind of accept that we're going to have these like AI overlords that we're all going to kind of bow and issue to. And it's hard for me because kind of as an entrepreneur, you're always looking for things that are really actionable that you can kind of take away from. So I thought about in this presentation, let me see, talking about trends that are actually trends in technology that are impacting us today and going to be increasingly so that people might not always think about. And I thought the first would be that technology has really allowed founders and entrepreneurs to really and truly be borderless. And just as an example, it was only a few years ago that somebody would come to me and say, hey, I have a company that's based in Canada, and in order to actually even transfer money to pay employees that are based outside the country, I have to physically go to the bank and actually sign off of it. So it basically makes it impossible for me to kind of have these offices and travel and work, etc. And all of that with the advances of fintech have completely gone away. And I think just as importantly, people would come up to me and say, hey, I don't know if you realize this, but now when I go to a cafe in Colombia or in parts of Asia, etc., the internet's actually faster than many parts in the US and Canada as well. And when you think about the implications of founders and entrepreneurs being borderless, it's particularly important because historically, particularly in the US, 2 out of every 3 jobs were created by small and medium-sized businesses. And I thought about most of the people here are probably either invested in the ecosystem of Kazakhstan as a founder or a community builder, or from the government's perspective. And the one constant that we know about creating jobs is investing in these small and medium-sized businesses. And if you think about founders and entrepreneurs being borderless, it really becomes this competition between different cities, different governments to attract and really develop these entrepreneurs. And I thought this article was really funny because most people, when I really kind of a product of Silicon Valley, a product of the New York area, most people internationally, they tend to look at Silicon Valley and think of it as like this amazing mecca that everyone wants to move to. But having spent a lot of time there are many entrepreneurs I know in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, who actually want to leave the area. And this is one example of it, why all these Bay Area residents leaving. And there are many reasons for that. That's the cost of rent, et cetera, how hard it is to find talented employees. And if you think about everything becoming so borderless, one big implication for that, let me see, is that it becomes this competition of governments and at the city and state level to attract people. One thing that, for example, the government of Chile did that was very effective is they said, hey, we want to attract these international entrepreneurs. We're going to give out these grants of $40,000 to bring companies here to start these companies. They started it many years ago, and it's become very successful to kind of foster that innovation. The reason why it's so important is that it's kind of the responsibility of government, these large organizations, to attract entrepreneurs to create these jobs. Just according to the study, small and medium-sized businesses generate approximately 2 out of every 3 new jobs. So it's incredibly important. This going on to kind of this next trend that is impacting us today. Let's see, which is many of you guys may have heard that Uniqlo replaced the fashion retailer, about 90% of its staff, with robots. So if you think about it from kind of a startup ecosystem perspective, from a government perspective, the most important thing that that provides stability to a lot of these societies is job creation. There's kind of this famous saying in the U.S., which is a recession is when your neighbor loses his or her job. A depression is when you lose your job. So it kind of has this huge impact. And when you see technology increasing at this accelerated pace, there's going to be a lot of job loss. And just going back to the the prior point, if according to this study, robot automation will take approximately 800 million jobs by 2030. There have been many reports about the job loss that's expected. The only solution today that kind of tried and true is to invest in small, medium-sized businesses to create this new job growth. Let's see. I think something else that has been in the news, but it's going to be increasingly so, is basically this fake news epidemic. It is a huge issue with the election in the United States, and I think it's going to be increasingly so, especially today. There's a great deal of technology that can be used to essentially alter these videos, etc. That and you can imagine kind of the implications of that, whether it's with elections, whether it's with other news online. To me, the solution to this is they're going to be introduced new platforms for trust within the media industry, within the news industries, and many others. And one example of that is you can imagine these review systems that exist on Airbnb. You would never have imagined being able to rent out your apartment or your place of living only a few years ago, and yet Airbnb basically introduced this system of trust in the system. And I expect we're gonna see kind of similar platforms and modems there introduced for news and media, where we're essentially going to go back to how it was many years ago, where what matters most is an individual and an organization's reputation. Let me see. I'm gonna run through. I think the other thing you're going to see a lot more of, the impact of technology on universities in particular. Obviously the one that comes to mind is online education. A very famous professor from Harvard University, he's predicting that within the next 10 to 15 years, half of the universities in the United States are going to go out of business. And I think from a government and startup leader perspective, what we're going to see is the rise of a lot of other institutions, for example, accelerator programs that serve as in that role to kind of best educate and prepare future leaders of society. So today, as an example, it wasn't that I remember when I raised funding for my first startup, people said, hey, you have to apply to this new program called Y Combinator. And I thought, you know what, wow, I have to give up 7% of my company for $20,000. I'm never going to, that doesn't make any sense. That valuation is way too low. And yet Y Combinator has become kind of super popular, and it provides this level of social proof as well. Just as much so, there are many cases now of people saying, hey, I don't even want to go to business school at Stanford University. I'd rather go through Y Combinator, because as opposed to having to spend money, I'll actually receive an investment, and it provides the same level of social proof. So I expect in the US and also around the world, we're going to see a lot more essentially kind of alternatives to traditional education. To me, again, the solution about with tech playing such a disruptive role with education is first for governments and kind of local leaders as well to focus on this lifelong learning as opposed to kind of this set number of degree. Also for a lot of these governments and universities to invest in these other programs to foster entrepreneurship and innovation. So one that comes to mind would be Stanford University, which of course is very well known, but there are many others. An example is Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, which has its own accelerator program where they invest in startups. So the focus is less on this specific degree and more about kind of the applicable skills that that people can receive. I think we're about to, yeah. Let me see. I guess we'll open up to questions for everyone. Awesome.
You're all set? Thank you. Если есть вопросы, коллеги, пожалуйста, задавайте. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Magrifa, and well, as you said, we're running incubation program in the STEM university here in Nazarbayev University, and we do understand like we need to do that even though now we have like pretty much zero results, but that's what we're doing for the like as a seed. I have a question. With the futurism, like with the technical students or grads or like post-grads, the major question is to get the idea. So, and one thing that we like insist them to do is to go to this like sci-fi just to get this inspiration and the futurism. What would you suggest as like the best tool to be inspired by the new ideas that will be like necessary in the future? Probably it's the question to both of you.
One thought that came to mind is I remember being told that basically on average the salary that you receive is going to be the average of your 5 closest friends. So kind of, and I remember in hindsight, I raised funding for my first startup when I was 19 in Silicon Valley. And I think in hindsight, what I would do is I'd go on Fridays and Saturdays to this bookstore and I would just read all these biographies about like the Richard Bransons and these famous entrepreneurs. And so the people that I identified with were these entrepreneurs who were traveling the world and doing all these kind of exciting things. And like that's what really inspired me. So I almost think the secrets to success for a lot of entrepreneurs is actually just reading as much as you can, and that kind of will inspire you. I think there's so many great resources online on YouTube, etc. But and events certainly help as well. But I would just that's kind of the first thought that came to mind. I don't know.
I'd say that I've heard from a very famous professor a phrase that 90% of innovation is adaptation. So if you have a team of people that is willing to do something, they could just take a world best practice and adapt it to local market. Another maybe useful bit of knowledge, when I was doing my master's degree, we had a venture capitalist gentleman with $1 billion fund came in and said that the way he decides where to invest is the strengths of team. And somebody wanted to ask a provocative question saying, will you invest serious money into a team that doesn't know what they're going to work on? They show up with no plan, but they're a strong team. What was his answer? Yes. So ideas will come. I think ideas are not, that's not the hard part. It's just getting something done is the hard part.
Еще вопросы будут? Please, yeah.
Thanks to both speakers for fascinating, very inspiring presentations. But I have to make 2 clarifying comments to what Mr. Chakoyan said. One, it's about the United Nations, and I have to make this comment because I work for the United Nations. So you said it's been created in opposition to something, but it lacks a vision, aspiration for what the common future for all should be. I think anyone... Yes. Yeah. No, I think anyone who has read the Charter of the United Nations or who has read the 2030 Agenda document will find that it's full of aspirations and vision statements to a fault. And I think what is frustrating, at least for people who work at the United Nations at times, is not that there is no vision, no aspiration, but that it's so difficult to actually make progress on it. And that is true due mostly to the fact that we are an intergovernmental organization built on the principle of consensus. So in order for us to move forward, we have to have a consensus of 192, 93 governments. I think that is really the frustrating part, but I completely disagree that there's no vision at the United Nations or aspirations. And the second comment, if I may, relates to the issue of how many jobs are at risk of being displaced by currently available technology. I think there we have to be really precise in what we talk about because we're at risk of creating a completely misleading impression. I've used currently available technology to check what McKinsey is really saying. And if I may quote, the proportion of occupations that can be fully automated using currently demonstrated technology is actually small, less than 5%, okay? So please, let's not propagate this myth that is 50% of jobs being at risk of being displaced right now. What it says here is that partial automation will affect 60% of jobs. So it is true that currently available technology and technology that will become available very soon will have a profound impact on the vast majority of jobs, but it certainly will not displace anywhere near half the jobs. So, and I think it's very important to make that clear and not to spook people, because if we continue to throw around figures like 50%, the end effect of that will be that we scare people of technology and we create a backlash that will make it actually more difficult to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those are excellent questions, and I agree with most of what you said. On the jobs, maybe I'll start with the second question. I've deliberately used the word work versus jobs. I agree. The jobs are not, every individual job is a multitude of skills, and humans are a lot better than machines at multitude of things, but machines are better at single tasks. The statistics I'm quoting is the type of work we're getting paid for, and what includes in my day as an employee in some business, the work that I do and I get compensated for could be automated, and the technology exists to do it. We either choose not to adopt it, or it's slow to adopt, or there are other reasons for why that doesn't create a situation where we work half the time. But that's the statistics. On the first question, I really couldn't agree more with what you said, that there is a mandate that UN has evolved and the vision of UN. My concern was with the genesis story of the world institutions. And the genesis, again, we sat down after 2 great wars as humanity and said, or not even humanity, but certain powers, and said, we need to do better. And it wasn't that, look, we are enlightened human beings, we've done, everyone's included, and we are going towards this vision. It's evolving. The issue I have is to acquire this mandate to build that global society, successful global society, inspired global society. The UN either doesn't have the right tools, or being a treaty-based organization assembled by the nation states. It's the other dynamic that I mentioned earlier, where nation states' power relative to everything else is declining. I'll send you an article, if you don't mind, where I make an argument for what kind of things could work. And why don't we have a UN-sponsored social network where people can, around the world, communicate on a neutral platform without the profit motive of the founding organizations? I know it's not an easy thing to do, right? It's like creating a social platform, doing a tech business for a global international organization is not an easy thing. But there could be other ways where technology could be used to bring people directly into the conversation. I'm not advocating that we mix Google and Facebook in the ranks of nation states, but who knows? We need something that's properly formatted for today's world. And UN has every right to lead in this, and I hope we see more of that leadership.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentations. Если больше вопросов нет, я бы хотел бы... Еще вопрос? Только очень быстро у нас просто.
Very quick one. Maybe you could share with us your online resources, like you read every day or every week, to just keep up with the trends, or like to predict the future trends, or maybe books that you would recommend to like young startups, especially tech startups.
Yeah, maybe after, you can discuss. Yeah.
I think myself, probably 3 that, I'm a big fan of the New York Times. I think for tech especially, I would say TechCrunch is probably a good resource. I would say along with that, there's a kind of a platform called Hacker News. It's kind of similar to Reddit, but really more kind of tech and startup focused. But especially some of the commentary, I find they do a good job of surfacing a lot of kind of the interesting kind of tech innovations that are happening. So those 3 kind of Hacker News, TechCrunch, and New York Times.
I say we're overwhelmed with information. The information shower is just way too much. So if you can carve out time to read books, is actually that would be my advice. Read fiction even. Don't the other news will catch up with you anyway.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate it.